Part 23. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee R. A Dream. Chapter 230. Be careful, these two weapons can be said to be very powerful, Rog said to Mr. Ninja King. Mr. Ninja King touched the bag on his waist and said, I'll try to see if I can crack this weapon. At this moment, MS pointed her fingers and said, Become a hedgehog. The two triple machine guns her arms transformed into fired deadly spiked bullets. These spiked bullets shot towards Rog and the two at a very high speed. Roger quickly rolled on the ground to avoid it. Mr. Ninja King also rolled over quickly. Although both of them had serious injuries, at this critical moment of life and death, they actually brought out the potential in their bodies and desperately dodged the attack. Mr. Ninja King was dodging and quickly threw a projectile towards MS's fingers. The projectile rolled down to the feet of MS's fingers and exploded quickly. A burst of astonishing smoke quickly enveloped MS's hands. This, MS looked around angrily with both fingers. The surroundings were so tightly wrapped in smoke that it was impossible to see clearly. MS both fingers are very anxious now. Although she is very strong in battle, and her attacks can have extremely powerful penetrating power. But it is not good at destroying the smoke. Now she is completely passive. But MS's fingers still have powerful senses. Who is it? MS suddenly found movement on the right rear with her fingers, quickly passed through her body, and fired groups of spiked bullets from the triple machine guns transformed into her arms. After the intensive fire attack, there was really no movement there, it was obviously empty. Could it be that I saw it wrong? MS said with both hands. At this time, in the thick smoke, behind MS's fingers, a figure was holding a deadly weapon to his mouth with both hands and was about to attack. MS felt something was wrong behind her with her fingers. She turned quickly. A steel needle shot towards her and hit her neck. After being hit by a steel needle on her neck, MS still shot forward with both fingers based on instinct. But the figure had fled quickly before he could shoot. MS was trying to look around with her fingers, but she suddenly felt the uncomfortable feeling starting from her neck quickly spread throughout her body. This is a very narcotic poison. MS with both fingers, I quickly felt that my whole body was about to collapse. Be it muscles, blood or guts as well as the head. Her vision began to blur. It seems that's the only way, MS whispered with her fingers. She quickly changed her arms back to normal, and then her two index fingers quickly turned into two spikes. Thorn therapy. Nerve stimulation. MS placed the two index fingers turned into spikes on the back of the neck with both fingers, aim at the spine connecting the head and the body, and stab hard. She gritted her teeth for a while and felt severe pain, but the feeling of numbness was relieved. The part of the spine that connects the head to the body is the center of nerves throughout the body. To stimulate here is to be able to stimulate the whole body. This method can temporarily mobilize the body to the highest active state. Even if you are poisoned, you can get rid of the poisoning effect. MS both fingers quickly became conscious from the severe pain. A terrifying smile that was different from the usual confident and enchanting smile appeared on her face. At this time, behind MS's two fingers. In the smoke, Mr. Ninja King is preparing to attack. Just now, Mr. Ninja King used Fukia, the assassination weapon that once attacked Zoro. A steel needle coated with poison was shot into both of MS's fingers. MS, as expected, both fingers were seriously poisoned and lost their fighting ability. This time is the best opportunity to make a move. Mr. the Ninja King took out a short weapon called a kunao that looked like a dagger but didn't look like it from the bag on his waist. At first glance, kunao looks like a dagger with a hanging ring on the back. This is often a tool used by ninjas to throw like a grappling hook. Of course, there are also some highly skilled ninjas who can use it as a throwing weapon. However, kunao is not like a shuriken that can rotate to generate powerful force, so throwing kunao can be said to be a very skilled skill. But Mr. Ninja King is the ninja who has mastered this attack. Mr. Ninja King held the kunai tightly in his right hand and aimed his fingers at the back of MS's head. Mr. Ninja King threw the kunai in his hand quickly, as fast as the wind. Just when the kunai was about to hit the back of MS's head with both fingers, suddenly, all the hair on the head of MS's fingers sprang outward, becoming like spikes. The head with two fingers is like a sea urchin covered with thorns. The originally fluffy long blue hair turned into a blue spike sea urchin. The kunai got stuck among the spikes and did not move forward. Mr. Ninja King looked at MS with both hands in shock. MS stood up with two fingers and took out the kunai stuck in her hair. She turned around and looked at Mr. Ninja King in the smoke. As expected of the rumored ninja from the land of peace, he actually has such a powerful assassination ability, MS said with both hands. She then threw away the bitterness and said, "I will return this thing to you." The kunai fell to the ground, and Mr. Ninja King was silent. "Don't be surprised, this is my thorn sea urchin. It has spikes growing out of its head to attack," MS said with her fingers. "You can withstand the poison on my hidden weapon, that's what I want to know," Mr. Ninja King said. MS with both fingers, the spiked hair that looked like an explosion returned to its original shape. "Ah, this is the highest ability of my thorn treatment. It can stimulate the body's nerves to the point where even poison cannot have an effect," MS said with her fingers. Mr. the Ninja King found it extremely difficult to deal with MS's fingers, so he had to use other weapons. At this moment, MS's fingers suddenly hugged her body into a ball. Then a group of sharp and hard spikes quickly sprouted from all sides of the body. These sharp spikes make MS's fingers look like hedgehogs. "Thorny hedgehog," MS said with both hands. She rolled towards Mr. Ninja King like a hedgehog. Mr. Ninja King quickly took out 3 explosive shurikens from the bag on his waist. Explosive shuriken. Mr. Ninja King threw 3 explosive shurikens at the thorny hedgehog. There were 3 violent explosions, but the thorny hedgehog that MS's fingers turned into was still not damaged at all. In this state of turning into thorns, the hardness is very high. It's hard to be hurt at all. Mr. Ninja King quickly took out Fukia again. He carefully observed MS's fingers, which were now in the form of a thorny hedgehog. Then a steel needle was shot out, but it had no effect at all. In this state, the steel needle cannot even penetrate MS's fingers. Is there really no other way? Then I have the ultimate powerful penetrating weapon. Mr. Ninja King took out a short bow from the bag on his waist, plus a bow and arrow. The bow and arrow are Mitsubishi-shaped 3-sided arrows with extremely high penetrating power. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 231. Mr. Ninja King drew the short bow and set the bow and arrow. Aiming the bow and arrow at the thorny hedgehog that MS's fingers turned into. Mr. Ninja King shot this powerful bow and arrow, and the Mitsubishi arrow of the bow whizzed like the wind and hit the thorn hedgehog. The thorny hedgehog was hit by a bow and arrow, and then stopped. Mr. Ninja King looked at the thorn hedgehog with a complicated expression. Could it be said that he succeeded? At this moment, suddenly a thorn shot out from the thorn hedgehog. Thorn spear. Mr. Ninja King was caught off guard and was stabbed in the left abdomen with a short spear. Mr. Ninja King screamed for a while and quickly lay down. The thorny hedgehog whose fingers turned into started rolling again. In the thorny hedgehog state, MS's fingers have extremely high defense capabilities. Even the bow and arrow that could penetrate iron armor could be resisted. The thorn hedgehog started rolling again, rolling towards Mr. Ninja King. Mr. Ninja King struggled to stand up and dodge. However, the serious injury to the left abdomen and the previous injuries made Mr. Ninja King's body become more and more painful. Cough. Mr. Ninja King vomited a mouthful of blood. Even the black cloth covering his mouth was soaked. He could hardly bear it. The thorny hedgehog took advantage of this time to keep approaching. Mr. Ninja King suffered another burst of severe pain and fell down. Taking advantage of this time, the thorny hedgehog rolled in front of him. This spherical object full of spikes wanted to pierce him full of holes. Suffer death, Ninja MS's fingers sounded. At this moment, a burst of ice suddenly shot over. It just hit the front of the thorny hedgehog, forming an ice lump that stuck the thorny hedgehog there. Mr. Ninja King looked towards the direction of the attack, and the smoke dissipated a lot at this time. He could clearly see that MS Spring Water Goddess was wielding a silver axe and launching a magic attack. At the same time, a vine whip quickly grabbed Mr. Ninja King and pulled him away from the thorny hedgehog. Rog used the vine whip to get Mr. Ninja King out of danger. Mr. Ninja King was pulled to his side by Rog with the vine whip. He looked at Rog and MS Spring Water Goddess. "I can't thank you enough," Mr. Ninja King said. Rog said, "It's nothing, we are fighting side by side after all." MS the Spring Water Goddess wielded a silver axe, and the attack just now limited the thorn hedgehog's rolling. Rog turned his head to Chopper again, and said, "Okay, Chopper. Please." Chopper walked over immediately and said, "Okay, leave it to me." Chopper walked up to Mr. Ninja King, quickly took off the backpack from his back, and began to help Mr. Ninja King treat him. Rog and MS Spring Water Goddess continued to fight with MS's fingers. But the current battle situation is still MS two fingers have the advantage. The thorny hedgehog began to break free from the ice lump again, and began to roll towards the crowd. MS the goddess of spring water gathered magic energy and shot out a beam of ice, hitting the thorny hedgehog and freezing it. However, this method cannot truly defeat MS two fingers. At most, it can delay the attack for a while. Rog put the Kinkin spear and rattan whip aside first, and then took out a new modified plant from his clothes. Now after a period of rest just now, Rog's body has also recovered. The energy of the plant fruit in the body is enough to use the plant weapon again. Roger took out a small wooden stake as thick as an arm from his clothes this time. "Okay, let's play. Wooden pile air cannon." Rog continuously injected the plant fruit energy in his body into the stake worn on his right hand. This wooden pile was also transformed by Rog before, and now it grows rapidly after re-injecting the energy of the plant fruit. The root of the stake quickly wrapped around Rog's right forearm, and a hole was exposed at the stake. The sweat on Rog's forehead and body also dripped like rain. Reluctantly using the energy of plant fruits now is extremely taxing on the body. The wooden stake air cannon finally completed its form. Now a wooden stake barrel as thick as an arm and a full 50 centimeters long is worn on Rog's right arm, and the root of the stake is wrapped around Roger's right arm. On for reinforcement. "Okay, ready to fire," Roger said. The front end of the staked air cannon on the right arm quickly sucks in air. A large amount of airflow poured into the muzzle at the front of the stake from the surroundings. After the muzzle at the front of the wooden pile sucked in enough air, it became as if it was holding back a burst of energy and was ready to shoot out at any time. Rog's left arm also helped his right arm, stabilizing the stake air cannon. Now MS the Spring Water Goddess used several attacks in succession, but in the end the thorny hedgehog transformed into MS's fingers, broke free from the ice mass and started to move. "Leave it to me," Rog said as he pointed the stake air cannon at the thorn hedgehog. MS the goddess of spring water was exhausted, and she couldn't hold on any longer, so she retreated. Roger stabilized the stake air cannon and aimed it at the billowing thorny hedgehog. Fire! The muzzle at the front of the stake air cannon on Rog's right arm fired an air cannonball that condensed a powerful airflow. Air cannonballs, as the name suggests, shoot out the compressed air at high pressure, and shoot it to the place like an air cannonball. The air cannonball shot out at a high speed, splitting the surrounding airflow and hitting the thorny hedgehog. The thorn hedgehog felt like it was hit by a shock wave, its entire body shook violently, and then stopped for a moment. "Just hit," Roger said. The thorny hedgehog relented after being hit before continuing to roll. "What kind of weapon? It's really strange," MS said with both hands. However, the thorny hedgehog transformed by MS's fingers is still able to move. Rog's stake air cannon can fire invisible projectiles formed by air compression, but its power is actually equivalent to the power of small projectiles and the power of some howitzers. However, Rog can adjust the power according to the stored compressed air. Roger used the staked air cannon to compress the air again to prepare for the attack. The thorny hedgehog rolled over again. Fire! Rog aimed at the thorny hedgehog and fired another shot. The thorny hedgehog was missed this time and rolled aside. However, the opponent then adjusted its position and continued to roll in preparation for the attack. Rog kept using the stake air cannon to attack, hitting the thorny hedgehog continuously. Ms. the goddess of spring water took off the silver axe and replaced it with a golden axe. She whispered a spell, and a ball of flame shot from the golden axe and hit the thorny hedgehog. "Damn it," Ms said angrily, pointing her fingers. The intense flames not only turned the thorny hedgehog into a flaming fireball, but also severely disrupted her vision. Although Ms has a high defense after turning her fingers into thorn hedgehogs, these flames cannot effectively harm her. But the flames still had the effect of seriously disrupting vision. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 232. The thorny hedgehog is now rolling randomly. When Rog saw this situation, he also had an idea in his mind. Ms. Spring Water Goddess. Please do me a favor. Continue to use fire attacks. Let her have no chance to breathe, Rog said. No problem, Ms. Spring Water Goddess said. Ms. the Spring Water Goddess then waved her golden axe and continuously attacked with magical flames. After being hit frequently, the thorny hedgehog continued to roll irregularly. At this time, Rog stored more powerful energy on the stake air cannon on his right arm. Powerful airflow continuously flows into the muzzle from the surroundings. The muzzle sucks in the air like a black hole. Rog himself also felt that the stake air cannon on his right arm had accumulated an exaggerated amount of energy, and he needed to strictly stabilize it with both arms. After accumulating energy, the stake air cannon has reached an unprecedented level of storing compressed air. Rog very carefully aimed the stake air cannon at the thorn hedgehog. And also pay attention to the sliding trajectory of the other party. When the thorny hedgehog was disturbed by the flames, he began to roll towards the moat. The muzzle of the air cannon on the stake on Rog's right arm, the thorny hedgehog, and the moat in the distance completely formed a straight line. Fire! The stake air cannon fired this powerful shot. The powerful air cannonball was shot out and hit the thorny hedgehog. The air cannonball exploded, and the powerful airflow formed an impact that pushed the thorny hedgehog towards the moat. The thorn hedgehog quickly rolled to the edge of the moat and fell down in the sight of Rog and others. Thump! The thorny hedgehog fell into the moat when Zheng. Successful Rog took his eyes away from the straight line at the muzzle of the stake air cannon. He successfully hit the opponent with this blow and drove him into the moat. When Zheng. The moat and the pyramid building are all covered with sea water, and Ms has devil fruit abilities on her hands and cannot swim. We won. Usopp and Luffy shouted happily when they saw Ms's fingers sinking into the moat. Rog looked to the other side of the moat and breathed a sigh of relief. Ms the goddess of spring water put down the golden axe and said, "Is it really successful?" Rog turned around and looked at Mr. Ninja King, who had received heavy support before. Mr. Ninja King was half lying on the ground. Chopper had already pulled out the spikes on his left abdomen and bandaged the wound with medicine. Rog walked to Mr. Ninja King and said to him, "Okay, we have beaten the opponent into the moat." Mr. Ninja King looked at Rog and said, "Ah, I saw it just now. You are really amazing." "Chopper, how is his injury?" Rog asked. Chopper said, "He suffered a lot of injuries. I treated his most serious injury on the left side of the abdomen. Then Chopper said seriously, Roger, you still have a lot of injuries that I haven't treated yet. Sit down quickly and I'll treat you. Seeing Chopper's serious doctor's expression, Rog also sat down and said, okay, thank you very much. Both fingers were finally defeated. On the other side, Sauron and Mr. One were having the unfinished duel last time. One of the two people was covered in blade weapons, and the other person had 3 samurai swords working together alternately. Sparks were flying, and the harsh metal sound echoed under the night sky. Ah! Zoro charged again, holding Kaititsu and Wado Ujiman tightly with both arms, while biting Yukaize in his mouth. After running for a while, Sauron jumped up suddenly. In mid-air, Sauron waved his arms upwards and backwards, aiming his entire body forward and downward. 3-sword style. Cutting wings against the wind. Sauron slashed down like an eagle flying from the sky to the ground. Mr. One is in front and below Sauron. After the strong man transformed his arms into 2 sharp knives, they crossed them in front of his head. At the same time, the left leg is half kneeling on the ground, and the right leg supports the body. Crosscut. Mr. One's body suddenly jumped up. Zoro then descended, and Mr. One rose from the ground. A harsh metal collision sounded. Sauron glides and lands safely on the ground like a flying eagle. Mr. One also jumped up and landed a few meters ahead. The arms are already spread out. The 2 men then stood still and turned to look at each other. The 2 men were fighting evenly just now. This confrontation was just a microcosm of the previous battles. Mr. One looked at Sauron and said, I didn't expect that your skills have improved. The last time I saw you, you were not so powerful. Zoro looked straight at Mr. One and said, swordsmen develop stronger fighting skills between life and death. Don't you know this? Mr. One shook his arms again and said, I am a killer, not a swordsman. This time Mr. One turned his hands into swords again, crossed them in front of his chest, and slashed downwards with a cross. Dust slash. Mr. One kills with great power. At this time, Zoro suddenly spun the 3 samurai swords he had prepared in advance around himself like a whirlwind. Tornado. Zoro created a tornado-like force around him, blowing himself up. Part of the force of Moat Slash was counteracted by the tornado, and part of it was to cut dense cracks on the bricks and stones on the ground, just like cutting countless tofu blocks. However, the tornado also had the effect of disrupting the line of sight. Mr. One observed the surroundings. Where is he going? Mr. One looked around but couldn't find Zoro. At this moment, Zoro was above Mr. One. Zoro acted extremely calm at this time, as if he was a hummingbird hanging in the air. Now Mr. One can't feel his murderous intent. The Yukigami in Zoro's mouth and the Wado Ikemon held in his arms were already parallel to Kaititsu, and he fell down using the force generated by the tornado just now. Zoro kept getting closer to Mr. One. Finally, he got close to the back of Mr. One's head. Santoryu. Hummingbird. The word Wado that Zoro held in his right arm quickly stabbed Mr. One straight into the back of his head. After one blow, the whole person quickly used the tip of the knife and the back of the opponent's head as a strong fulcrum, and the whole person turned somersaults in the air. While he was turning somersault quickly, the tip of Zoro's Kaititsu sword on his left arm stabbed the back of Mr. One's head very quickly. After using Hummingbird, Sauron landed smoothly. Although Mr. One's body was indestructible, Zoro's 2 blows delivered a lot of force, causing Mr. One's head to vibrate for a while. Oh damn it! Mr. One roared angrily. He quickly raised his right arm high. Zoro quickly prepared to escape. Iron Arm Slash. A powerful force slashed out, Sauron dodged urgently. There is another ravine on the ground of the pyramid building that is more than meters long and several meters deep. Although Sauron successfully dodged the attack, he still had lingering fears. In this battle, Mr. One has obviously been greatly strengthened. Even with the same move, the attack is greatly enhanced. Obviously, after suffering the loss of returning without success last time, Mr. One is also determined to kill Zoro and others. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 233. After Mr. One's iron arm slash attack failed, the burly man looked at Zoro. Sauron's battle this time has obviously improved a lot compared to last time. In terms of flexibility and point assassination, Sauron has already made leaps and bounds. You really suffered the loss last time. You have made great progress this time, Mr. One said to Sauron. Thank you for the compliment, Zoro said to Mr. One. Now Sauron is very clear that he is still at a disadvantage. After all, the opponent is a Vajra with an indestructible body. Itself is flesh and blood. Now is the time to use that powerful move that was truly realized. Zoro put Yuki and Haogui Tetsu back into the scabbard at his waist. Only the word Hideo held in both hands remains. This incomparably precious samurai sword is the one that accompanied Sauron the longest among the three swords. Tonight is to use its most powerful power. Mr. One looked at Sauron's posture, raised his eyebrows, and asked, "What are you doing?" Zoro first glanced at the blade of Hideo Ujiman. The dim light of the waning moon and stars shone on it, making the metal blade sparkle. He moved his gaze to the Lianjian and then to Mr. One dozens of meters away. Of course I want to cut off your indestructible body, Sauron said after being silent for a long time. Zoro looked at Mr. One in the distance and began to recall his life as a swordsman since his childhood. Since he was a child, he has been a kind teacher who has helped him grow with a smile and strictness. Koshiro, his kind teacher, once told him this sentence. There are swordsmen in the world who can cut through everything, but they can cut through steel. Zoro wanted to practice the sentence tonight. At this moment, Sauron held his breath. Everything around him seemed to be still, but all that could be heard were all the sounds on the ground. Whether it is animate or inanimate things. It's all about making him feel in motion. Everything in the world is in motion, water flows, air blows, rocks turn into sand, and the sun and the moon alternate. Everything is breathing. Everything has a gap, as long as you can find it. Even the incomparably hard steel is the same. Mr. One felt unnatural when he saw Sauron's momentum. How long do you want to be in a daze? I will send you to the west. Mr. One's knees were slightly bent. The soles of Mr. One's feet became like blades, just like skates. His whole body glides quickly. Both arms also turned into swords, ready to attack. He quickly approached Sauron, 15 meters, 10 meters, 8 meters, 6 meters, 3 meters. The two swords that Mr. One's arms turned into were already raised and about to be chopped down. Suffer death. Mr. One roared. Zoro's eyes suddenly opened at this time, and he jumped up. One sword style. I slaying. The lion sings. The word Wado in Sauron's hand was like lightning, and Mr. One didn't even see how Sauron attacked. His eyes just saw a bolt of lightning. Sauron's body has already jumped behind him. Sauron stabilized his body again, and put down the word Hideo. Cut it open. Sauron just said this indifferently. What? A scream rang out, and the burly body of Mr. One behind him suddenly fell down. Zoro turned his head and looked at Mr. One, who was lying on the ground. The blow just now had indeed cut through the indestructible body of the Vajra. Zoro looked at the Hideo Yizuan and his hands in his hand. It is not only the sharpness of the weapon that really cuts through the indestructible body of King Kong, but also the skill of the user. I must be able to master this skill at any time, Sauron said with great determination. The success of this blow tonight does not mean that it will always be successful. Sauron made up his mind to be able to unleash this mighty attack literally all the time. It's amazing. Suddenly, a low but admiring voice sounded. There was a bit of pain in that voice. Zoro was shocked to see that Mr. One, whose indestructible body had been broken just now, actually got up again. The blow just now really cut the opponent open. Mr. One stood up again with some pain. He was obviously injured too. The burly man turned around and looked down at Sauron again. Mr. One was sweating on his forehead because of the pain. On his chest, there was a knife mark obliquely from the left side of the collarbone. The steel-like body was also cut open. Zorro looked at the other person and said, "You're not dead yet." Huh, there are many levels of the Vajra indestructible body. Some people only have the Vajra indestructible body on the outside, but they are extremely weak on the inside. I am the real Vajra body from the inside out, from the muscles, skin, bones, and internal organs. It's as hard as steel. Your knife can cut open my body, but it can't cut me completely, so it can't kill me. It's the same as using a sword to only cut a flesh wound on the opponent. Mr. One's mouth twitched. The way. Zorro looked at the mountain-like opponent in front of him that was difficult to defeat. Said, "It is really an opponent more difficult to shake than King Kong." Mr. One's mouth twitched more and more because of the pain from the wound, and the expression on his face became much more ferocious. He said painfully, "I have to admit that you hurt me a lot. That's why I want you to die miserably." Although the blow just now did not kill Mr. One, it still caused the opponent's body pain. Sauron looked at the invincible King Kong and said, "Then I will stay with you to the end. I also hope to sharpen more so that my blade can cut through enemies that are harder than steel. Then come on, foaming daisy chop." Mr. One's palms and fingers turned into blades, crossed between his wrists, and slashed towards Zorro quickly. Sauron clenched his hands tightly to resist the attack. Huge force hit the samurai sword in Sauron's hand. The shock wave killed the surrounding area and opened several cracks more than 10 meters long. Sauron himself was also thrown away because of the powerful force. "What?" Sauron's cry resounded through the night sky below the pyramid building. At this time, Rog and the others had already pushed MS's fingers into the sea water in the moat. At this moment, Sauron's voice suddenly sounded in Rog's ear. "I saw Zorro being thrown to the top of the pyramid building by the huge force." Sauron fell heavily on a masonry with almost no buffer. "What's going on?" Usopp said in shock. "That voice just now was Zorro," Chopper said in shock. Rog looked at the position where Sauron fell, stood up quickly and said, "It's really him. Wait a minute." Rog and Usopp looked in the direction where Sauron fell, and saw a burly figure rushing towards Sauron. It is Mr. One, who is full of incredible murderous aura. Mr. One was like a crazy monster at this time. The previous stoic and tough style of a warrior monk is gone forever. Only a devil-like will to kill is left. Usopp put on his goggles and carefully observed Mr. One, his whole body trembling with fear. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 234. "Devil, real devil," Usopp said with shaking legs. After hearing this, Chopper also hugged Usopp and said, "That's a devil. Isn't he that, Mr. One?" Luffy also tried hard to use his rubber power to stretch his neck to observe Mr. One, who was now like a demon. Rog looked serious. Mr. One was so crazy. And Zorro might not be able to hold on anymore. "Everyone, let's go. Sauron needs support." Rog turned his head and said. Luffy, Chopper and Rog looked at each other and nodded. Mr. Ninja King and MS Spring Water Goddess also nodded. After looking left and right, Usopp reluctantly swallowed and nodded. "Let's go," Rog said. A total of 6 people rushed towards Mr. One to block his movement. Mr. One was already in a crazy state at this time, and he tore the clothes on his upper body. Clang came out of his mouth, a harsh vibration sound like the sound of metal collision. This was his frantic cry. Mr. One's appearance began to change drastically. Before, it was only partially like a knife blade. Now his skin has rapidly become like a blade, and his head, chest, legs, and arms are all metal that has become like a blade. Even on the head, a sharp knife more than 1 meter long quickly grew out like a rhinoceros. Zoro stood up from the falling masonry after receiving the heavy blow just now. He saw Mr. One, who looked like a steel demon, rushing towards him. The opponent quickly turned the top of his head towards him and rushed towards him. Zoro suddenly clenched the Wado Ikemon with both hands, and the blade of the samurai sword collided fiercely with the broadsword on the opponent's head. Chong! An ear-piercing sound sounded. Sauron desperately resisted the opponent's attack, and the opponent really pushed him back with the big knife on his head like a rhinoceros. Sauron's power is obviously not as good as Mr. One. His feet kept rubbing against the masonry, and he kept backing away. Tear you to pieces. When Zoro was pushed forward and suppressed by the opponent, Mr. One's two hands, or arms that had become like two front paws, quickly grabbed his chest and abdomen. What? There was a horrific scream for a while. Sauron's chest and abdomen were seriously injured, and his whole body was exhausted and pushed away. Mr. One raised his head and roared for a while. He quickly aimed the big knife above his head at Sauron, who was almost on the ground again, intending to assassinate him. Zoro looked at the big knife above the opponent's head and whispered, "Is everything over?" But survival is very important to swordsmen, and they must do their best to survive before achieving their own goals. Zoro quickly pulled out the snow from his waist and walked away. The big knife on the opponent's head stabbed. Eagle wave. Zoro slashed two sword auras at the masonry below him, and the force generated by the sword aura bounced his body to the masonry above him. Then there was a harsh sound of masonry breaking, and the big knife above Mr. One's head stabbed a 1-meter deep crack where Zoro was just now. There are also cracks all around. Mr. One pulled out the sword above his head and looked at Zoro above the masonry. "Okay, I'll let you die without a burial this time." Mr. One actually put his hands down this time, and he was completely on all fours this time. The demon landed on all fours and began to jump wildly. Although it is a sloping pyramid building, these bricks and stones provide enough footholds. Mr. One quickly ran towards Zoro. Zoro finally took a breath, but saw Mr. One charging forward like a wild beast. What is this? At this moment, Sauron really felt that Mr. One was really like a steel rhinoceros. Sauron had a premonition that if he hit the bar hard, he would be seriously injured. His chest and abdomen were seriously injured just now, and now his clothes are soaked in blood. If he receives any more support, he will escape death. But he also felt that if he just ran for his life, he would definitely die. The only chance of survival is resistance. Zoro also pulled out Kaititsu from his waist. "Hold it in your mouth." Three-sword style. Tornado. Sauron's three knives spun rapidly, and the sword energy generated by the blades formed a tornado around them. The previous battle produced a lot of rubble on the pyramid building, and the sword energy of the tornado itself also produced a lot of brick and stone particles. These forming tornadoes combined with the darkness of night make visibility even worse. Sauron also took advantage of the momentum and jumped up in the tornado. Mr. One rushed up quickly. The big knife on his head wants to split everything. Beheaded. Mr. One approached the tornado and jumped up. The big knife above the head produced enough force to split the ground. The huge force split Sauron's tornado apart, and the power of the tornado was scattered to both sides and in all directions. The bricks and stones of the pyramid building were also cut into dozens of pieces. Sauron was also hit by the opponent's strength, and his whole body flew up. Finally, it fell heavily to the ground below the pyramid building. Just when Sauron was seriously injured and unable to move, suddenly a soft elastic thing below caught him. "This is..." Sauron looked down at him in shock. At this time, Rogue, Mr. King of Ninja, Usopp and Chopper actually pulled Luffy away like a spring bed. Zoro was successfully rescued. "Zoran, are you okay?" Rogue said. Zoro was then put down, and Chopper rushed to his side to check. Sauron's chest and abdomen were seriously injured, and the impact just now caused serious internal injuries. The bleeding is now severe. No, I have to rescue him now, Chopper said. Roger looked at Chopper. The serious reindeer took out the medicine in the backpack, quickly took out a few pills from a medicine bottle full of blood coagulation medicine, and stuffed them skillfully into Sauron's mouth. Sauron's bleeding is very serious. I will stop the bleeding first, then apply medicine and suture the wound. You are all covering, Chopper said. No problem, Rog and Usopp said. Rog looked away from Sauron and Chopper. Everything is called to Chopper. Now he needs to work with Usopp and the others to contain the crazy Mr. One. Rog turned his head and looked at the pyramid building. What made people shudder was that the devil-like Mr. One rushed down unstoppably. He was still on all fours. This is no longer the god of Ra, who makes everyone who sees him feel a chill in their hearts. We must contain him and spread our attacks. Support each other, Rog said. Understood, Mr. Ninja King and others said. Rogue, Mr. King of Ninjas, Usopp, MS Spring Water Goddess, and Luffy attacked the demons separately. Rog first gathered the air from the stake air cannon on his right arm again, and a large amount of airflow gathered from the muzzle. Roger struggled to stabilize the staked air cannon on his right arm. It doesn't seek to kill the other party, but to divert the other party's attention. Mr. One has already rushed to the ground of the pyramid building. Rog aimed the stake air cannon at Mr. One's head. Fire! An air cannon shell was fired from the muzzle of the wooden stake air cannon, hitting the head of Mr. One with a strong airflow. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 235. The strong airflow hit Mr. One on the head, causing him to fall immediately. Mr. One itself is powerful, but Rog's attack with wooden pile air cannon can cause disruption, causing him to temporarily lose his sense of direction and knock him down. The power of an air cannon shell could not harm Mr. One at all. This demon-like guy stood up again and started rushing towards Rog. Asshole! Mr. One's left arm turned into an integrated broadsword. He raised it and slashed at Rog. The force of this blow was astonishing, cutting a 2-meter deep ravine on the ground for more than 10 meters. Roger evaded the attack urgently. But it was extremely thrilling just now. Rog was almost hit by the opponent's attack. Mr. One continued to rush towards Rog and pointed the big knife on his head at Rog. At this time, behind Mr. One, Usopp used a slingshot to pull up a weapon. The killing flame star. Usopp shoots a fire star. The flame star hit Mr. One, who was rushing towards Rog, shrouding Mr. One in a ball of flames. Mr. One quickly stopped charging, and the flames on his body were extinguished with a sudden shake. He turned his head in the direction of Usopp. Those violent eyes were already powerful enough to frustrate opponents. Usopp was so frightened that his whole body went cold. Chong! Mr. One roared angrily. The sound coming out of his mouth was like metal scraping. He landed on all fours, and rushed towards Usopp like a steel rhinoceros. Help! Usopp ran away desperately. Mr. One pursued him in a violent state. At this time, Mr. Ninja King quickly marched to the right rear of Mr. One. He pulled out 4 explosive shurikens from the bag at his waist, holding 2 in each hand. Go! Mr. Ninja King accurately threw 4 explosive shurikens. The 4 explosive shurikens all hit Mr. One, and then exploded violently. Mr. One roared angrily, then turned quickly and rushed towards Mr. Ninja King. Mr. Ninja King quickly escaped with his ghostly footwork. When it comes to escape skills, Mr. Ninja King may be the most superb among all the people present. Mr. One was running faster and faster. He used the sword on his head and his body to send a shocking slash forward. The huge force generated by the slash struck forward. Mr. Ninja King quickly somersaulted to the side, and the huge force generated by the slash hit the pyramid building in a straight line, and opened another crack in the already devastated huge building. Mr. 1 roared and continued sprinting. Mr. Ninja King reached into the bag on his waist again, took out another projectile and threw it out. The projectile exploded in front of the Mr. 1, creating a burst of smoke. The area of more than 10 meters around is covered by smoke. But before Mr. Ninja King could take the next step, a huge force suddenly burst out from the smoke. The smoke was completely defeated by the strength and dissipated. Mr. the King of Ninja looked at Mr. 1 who was splitting the smoke with his slashing force, and said, "I knew this would happen." But just as Mr. 1 split the smoke, a piece of ice hit his body, freezing it into a big lump of ice. Mr. Ninja King looked to the left of Mr. 1. Several dozen meters to the left was MS Spring Water Goddess. MS the goddess of spring water used the silver axe to perform an ice attack. MS the spring water goddess's face was covered with sweat. The maximum attack she is capable of now is this attack. Like the fire, ice, wind, and Trinity before, she couldn't use that kind of powerful attack at all. She doesn't have the energy to consume that kind of attack now. However, MS Spring Water Goddess will still attack to the maximum extent. But immediately the ice lump was broken through. Mr. 1 used its huge strength to break through the ice mass and shatter it into a group of ice cubes. Mr. 1 charged fiercely towards MS Spring Water Goddess. MS the goddess of spring water was preparing to continue the attack, but suddenly a huge brick hit Mr. 1. Mr. 1 was hit by a huge masonry, but did not roll several meters away. Rog, Mr. Ninja King and MS Fountain Goddess all saw Usopp pulling Luffy away like a giant slingshot. Usopp used the broken ground on the battlefield to drive 2 stakes, and asked Luffy to wrap his feet around them. Usopp hugged Luffy's body and pulled it away like a slingshot. Luffy was holding a huge brick with both hands. "All right, ready for the second one," Usopp said. Luffy hugged Brick and said, "Okay, get ready to launch Brick." Captain Usopp calibrated the giant slingshot that Luffy had transformed into and aimed it at Mr. 1. "All right, the monster with the big sword on its head. Let's try how powerful the marksman Captain Usopp is." Usopp released the giant slingshot that Luffy had transformed into. Luffy's body bounced forward, and when the bounce reached the limit, he let go of his hands. Another huge brick flew towards Mr. 1. Mr. 1 did not dodge, but was hit by this huge brick again, and he rolled several meters away. This giant slingshot is really powerful. Usopp and Luffy used this method to continuously shoot more than 10 huge bricks and hit Mr. 1. Mr. 1, although it is difficult to be harmed due to its indestructible body, it can be restrained. Rog also observed everything around him and said, "There seems to be a way to defeat him." Rog naturally focused his attention on the moat around the pyramid building. Mr. 1 is also a devil fruit user. He can be defeated by throwing him into the sea water. Rog quickly rushed towards Mr. Ninja King and asked him, "I ask you, do you have a weapon that can make your opponent fascinated?" "I'm Sakura," Mr. Ninja King replied simply. As expected by Rog, ninjas have been engaged in assassinations and infiltrations for a long time, so they will definitely be equipped with some kind of weapons. Before Rog could continue to speak, Mr. Ninja King took out a gourd from the bag on his waist. The gourd was all red. What's inside is a specially made strong medicine that can make people intoxicated and lose their ability to judge in a short period of time. It's not enough and I didn't make it into explosives, so I just detonated it with the explosive shuriken Mr. Ninja Ji Kingly way. Mr. Ninja King installed 2 explosive shurikens near the top of the red gourd. Then cast them all together. Red gourds and explosive shurikens approached Mr. 1. Boom boom boom. The explosive shuriken exploded, blasting the red gourd. The strong colorless medicine inside also turned into water mist, surrounding Mr. 1. Mr. 1 was already in a violent state, but now his body shook as soon as he inhaled this strong medicine. Chiang chiang. Mr. 1 roared into the night sky. Afterwards, his body became even more violent, and he grabbed at the surroundings indiscriminately. At this time, Rog took out the cane whip again, and tied it to a broken stone. Go ahead, Rog threw the gravel tied to the vine whip towards Mr. 1. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 236. The gravel fell in front of Mr. 1 with a clang. Originally, Mr. 1 was extremely violent, but now that he has inhaled the drug, he is completely intoxicated, no different from a wild beast. Mr. 1 quickly grabbed the stone, but Rog used a vine whip to pull the stone away, leaving him with no chance. Rog continued to pull the stone, while Mr. 1 was in hot pursuit. It actually succeeded. Rog secretly thanked himself while carefully pulling the stone. Just like some animals are attracted by the bait, Mr. 1 was attracted to the side of the moat by the stone tied to the vine whip. After the previous battle, there is still a lot of sea water in the moat. If Mr. 1 is pulled over, it can still be defeated. Just when Rog was about to succeed, the night sky went zheng. Under the cover of the dim night sky, two senior intelligence agents from the Baroque studio, a civet cat riding on a flying vulture. They are the unfortunate combination, Mr. 13 and Ms. Friday, two agents observing the battle together. Mr. 13, who was dressed in sleepy clothes, sat on Ms. Friday's back. After carefully observing Mr. 1's disadvantageous situation in this battle, he told Ms. Friday some unique animal languages that were incomprehensible. Ms. Friday then lowered the height very lightly. Now that the night is dim, everyone's attention is focused on Mr. 1. Ms. Friday has two machine guns ready on her back, and the Mr. 13 on her back is ready with a grenade gun. Mr. 13 aimed the grenade gun at Rog, who was attracting Mr. 1's attention. He pulled the trigger, and a grenade shot towards Rog, who was concentrating on it at this time. Roger only saw a sudden flash of light in front of his eyes. Boom! Everyone was stunned. Roger suddenly exploded. Then two machine gun bullets came down, and Roger was hit without error. Roger! Usopp and Luffy shouted in shock. Mr. Ninja King and Ms. Spring Water Goddess were also shocked. Roger fell to the ground, life and death unknown. Mr. Ninja King quickly discovered the enemy in the night sky. He saw a vulture and a civet cat, which were the unique intelligence combination of the Baroque studio. There Mr. Ninja King said. Ms. the goddess of spring water, Usopp and Luffy were also the vultures and tanukis who discovered the flying attack. The unlucky pair of agents went on the attack. They turned around and continued the attack with grenades and machine guns. The target of this attack is Usopp and Luffy. Usopp was so frightened that he ran away for his life, while Luffy also ran away. Deadly Flame Star Usopp hid behind a brick and shot a flame star with a slingshot. But the vulture's ability to fly is unbelievable, and he quickly sideways to avoid the attack. Rubber. Anti-aircraft gun. After Luffy prepared, he punched his right fist upwards. This time, the civet cat sitting on the back of the vulture smiled strangely, and then fired a grenade. The grenade hit Luffy's fist. Luffy below suddenly twitched for a while. Very painful. Luffy retracted his right fist, only to see that the fist was covered with nails. This is a fragmentation grenade. After the explosion, a lot of nails can be shot out. At this time, Mr. Ninja King quickly groped for a piece of brick on the side of the pyramid building, looking for an opportunity to kill the pair of agents. Mr. Ninja King took out the short bow and arrows, and put the bow and arrow on the short bow. The vulture and civet cat flew towards Ms. Spring Water Goddess again at this time, preparing to attack. Ms. the goddess of spring water was actually most afraid of this kind of shooting attack. She quickly used some of her remaining magic to freeze the front and top of her body with ice as a defense. The unlucky combination of civet cats and vultures began to attack with grenades and machine guns. Ms. the spring goddess's defense with ice cubes was also destroyed. At this time Mr. Ninja King found the best time to attack. The short bow in his hand also shot deadly arrows. With a scream, the bow and arrow of Mitsubishi Arrow hit the vulture. The vulture fell quickly, and fell down together with the civet cat above. Mr. Ninja King quickly jumped over. But I saw that the vulture actually wanted to fly again. Looking closely, the vulture was actually wearing a set of light armor, causing the bow and arrow to only shoot into a part of the body. Maybe this vulture can fly again. MS Spring Water Goddess, I leave it to you, Mr. Ninja King shouted suddenly. MS the Spring Water Goddess immediately understood the meaning and said, "Okay." She raised the silver axe and whispered an incantation. Then a blast of ice shot at the vulture and tanuki, who were trying to fly again. The vulture and civet cat were quickly frozen into a big lump of ice. Mr. Ninja King, MS Spring Water Goddess, Usopp and Luffy all rushed over. "Okay, you actually beat us so badly," Usopp said angrily. He swung a stick at the lump of ice for a while. "Isn't this the unfortunate combination in the Baroque studio, which is responsible for intelligence?" MS Spring Water Goddess said. "They have been monitoring us in the dark. They took action at this time," Mr. Ninja King said. Luffy looked angrily at the two agents who were frozen into lumps of ice. "You actually beat my partner like that, rubber rocket launcher." Luffy attacked angrily. This blow was powerful, and the powerful thrust knocked the ice lumps into the air. The ice lumps flew towards the masonry on the side of the pyramid building. Under normal circumstances, the pushed enemies may be killed or injured. But now the two agents who were unfortunately combined were frozen into ice cubes. There was a piercing sound of ice shattering, and the ice lump, together with the vultures and civet cats inside, shattered into a pile of ice. The intelligence agents of the two Baroque studios were still frozen in body movements and expressions in the end, but they were shattered into a pile of frozen meat. All four looked at the pair of crushed ice cubes. Usopp felt sick when he saw the broken frozen flesh of the tanuki and vulture. But he added, "Ah, they deserve to die. But I still want to get some information." "Forget it, let's take a look at Rog quickly." The four rushed towards the place where Rog was knocked down just now, although there was only a faint light in the night to illuminate this place. But Rog's body was covered with pity holes at this time, and he fell to the ground. His body was covered with scars and blackened areas. "Rog!" Usopp shouted in pain. "You can't die!" Luffy shouted with tears streaming down his face. Mr. Ninja King and MS Spring Water Goddess looked ugly at night. Rog was in a coma for a while, and in his consciousness he saw darkness around him. There seems to be no end in sight. But there was a voice calling to him. Sound. Roger remembered something, and tried his best to get out of the darkness. Sure enough, there was a glimmer of light in the darkness. Rog rushed out of this ray of light. Immediately afterwards, Roger opened his eyes. Above him, he saw Usopp, Luffy, Mr. Ninja King and MS Spring Water Goddess looking down at him. Right, I was injured, it was a sudden attack," Rog said reluctantly. "That's great," Luffy said with a high chest. "The bastards who attacked you, namely the tanuki and the vulture, were killed by us." "Don't worry," Usopp said very excitedly. "Where's Mr. One?" Rog suddenly asked. Usopp's face instantly stiffened. "Although they killed the unfortunate combination that came out for a sneak attack, Mr. One, the most terrifying enemy, still exists." Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 237. Usopp and the others looked around. Under the pyramid building, Mr. One was rolling around. The fascinated Mr. One is now going crazy. However, he spun around on the ground indiscriminately, temporarily unable to threaten everyone. "What a tough opponent," Usopp said. "If he returns to the way he was before the traditional Chinese medicine, he will be in big trouble," Mr. Ninja King said with some worry. Luffy said very excitedly, "Ah, he is rolling. It's so interesting." Although Rog is now seriously injured and unable to move freely, he also judges that the current situation has become very bad. Chong. Mr. One looked up to the sky and roared. The sound was like the friction of a harsh metal blade. The sound made the people present, and even the people in some nearby urban areas, shudder. But the effects of the medicine will eventually wear off. Mr. One hugged his head and stabbed the ground with the big knife on his head, and then pulled out the big knife. At this time, when everyone saw it, they all felt shuddering in their hearts. Mr. One's momentum at this time has returned to the previous violent state. Although he is still in a violent state, at least he does not look like he is in a state of confusion and loses the direction of his attack. The devil is back to normal again, Mr. Ninja King said. Mr. One looked at the crowd fiercely. Those eyes seemed to be glowing, staring at everyone. I will cut you to death with 1,000 knives. Mr. One roared fiercely. Usopp shivered and stepped back in fright. Mr. Ninja King was also covered in sweat and said, there is no other way but to fight. Mr. One landed on all fours, ready to rush towards the crowd. And many more. At this moment, a voice suddenly sounded. Usopp, Mr. King of Ninja, and Mr. One all looked aside. I saw a figure striding towards here. No way. Usopp said in surprise. It was cured so quickly, Mr. Ninja King said in shock. Zoro Luffy shouted excitedly. Sauron strode here, his face was still full of blood, but the tenacity and sharpness of a swordsman in his eyes returned. Zoro's eyes were like knives piercing Mr. One, and he said, your opponent is me. Mr. One roared, wondering why Sauron was not killed. Zoro officially stood in front of Usopp and Mr. King of Ninja. Sauron. Suddenly Chopper rushed over again. This reindeer in human form was very angry and said to Sauron, why are you like this? Didn't I tell you that you couldn't fight immediately? Your wounds will be reopened. Sauron kept his eyes fixed on Mr. One and said, fighting is about improving yourself between life and death. Seeing that Zoro could not be persuaded, Chopper clenched his fists very angrily and helplessly. Usopp hurriedly said to Chopper, Chopper, Rog was injured just now. Help him heal quickly. Chopper looked at Rog, who was half lying on the ground in surprise, and said, Rog, how could you be injured like this? Rog held back the pain in his body, and said calmly, don't be so surprised. This is a very normal thing. It's not just 1 or 2 injuries. Chopper quickly squatted down and said, lie down and I'll treat you. Don't be like this. Rog quickly grabbed Chopper's hand with his hand. But you were so seriously injured, Chopper said eagerly. Don't worry, you can join them to fight too, Roger said firmly. Rog also noticed that Sauron was looking at him just now. Even as a swordsman who pursues martial arts, Sauron still attaches great importance to his partners in his heart. Rog said to everyone here, okay, everyone. Now we are facing a common threat, and we need to unite to solve him. Let's fight together. Okay, everyone said, including Zoro. Now everyone shares the same hatred and looks towards Mr. One. Mr. One, beasts and demons looked at everyone. Rog tried hard to stand up, but his legs suffered a lot of bullet damage and it was difficult to stand up. Chopper, please help me put it on top of that brick, Rog said to Chopper. Chopper picked up Rog and went to a brick in the area below the pyramid building designated by Rog. Okay, here it is, Roger said. Chopper finally ran back, preparing to fight Mr. One. Rog sat on the masonry and adjusted the stake air cannon on his right arm. Everyone else is participating in the war, how can I just sit back and watch the battle? At critical moments, Rog will attack with staked air cannons. Zoro, Usopp, and the others share the same hatred and prepare to fight against Mr. One. Mr. One was now full of rage and was on all fours ready to attack. Mr. Ninja King took the lead and took out a shuriken from the bag on his waist. The centerpiece of this shuriken is a projectile. There are very powerful chemicals stored inside. Mr. the King of Ninja threw the shuriken out first. The shuriken hit Mr. One on the head and exploded. The shuriken exploded, creating a swarm of goo. they glue the head of Mr. 1. These sticky substances also stuck Mr. 1's eyes together. At this time, Mr. 1's eyes were stuck and his vision blurred rapidly. He was on all fours and could not remove the sticky substances immediately. "Everyone, hurry up," Mr. Ninja King shouted loudly. Everyone quickly began to attack. "Well done, strike first." Usopp quickly loaded the slingshot with his homemade special weapon. Usopp puts a rotten egg on top of the slingshot. The rotten egg star. Usopp fired this smelly weapon. The rotten egg hit Mr. 1 on the head accurately. There was a sticky substance on his head originally, but this time it was stained with rotten eggs. It can be said that it stinks to heaven. Chong! Mr. 1 roared angrily. Although he was very violent, he recalled that he had been exposed to this kind of weapon last time in the desert. Before Usopp finished, he took out 3 more rotten eggs. 3 consecutive rotten eggs must be killed. Usopp shot 3 rotten eggs one after another. The 3 rotten eggs all accurately hit Mr. 1 on the head, completely plunging him into a foul-smelling environment. What surprised everyone was that Usopp's rotten egg attack was actually more powerful than any poison or medicine attack. Mr. 1 enters a state of blind attack. Of course, with the sticky substance produced by Mr. Ninja King's previous shuriken explosion, these rotten eggs can more effectively affect Mr. 1's senses. Mr. 1 is a beast now, and beasts are most afraid of stimulation. Usopp got harder and harder, and he continued to attack with more weapons. Usopp took out another red projectile and placed it on the slingshot. And aimed the slingshot at Mr. 1's open mouth. Must kill Chili Star. This red projectile was shot into Mr. 1's mouth by Usopp with a slingshot. Then Mr. 1 made a manic sound for a while. Usopp said proudly, "Ha ha ha, this is the power of Chili." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 238. He took out another black projectile and used the slingshot to aim at Mr. 1's mouth. Mr. 1, who had been in a violent state, opened his mouth and roared. The bitter star. Usopp relied on his superb shooting ability to use a slingshot to shoot the black projectile into Mr. 1's open mouth. Mr. 1 was followed by another violent shaking. He banged his head on the ground and kept spitting out gastric juices from his mouth. That's disgusting. What weapon did you use? Chopper asked. Usopp pointed his thumb at himself very proudly, and said, "Of course I made it with various items that can produce bitterness. For example, bitter gall, bitter grass, bitter sea salt and so on." Chopper suddenly realized it and said, "So that's how it is. No wonder you had to ask me to borrow these bitter medicines that day." "Everything Captain Usopp does is valuable," Usopp said proudly. At this time, Luffy suddenly rushed up. "You've performed enough, it's my turn." Luffy rushed forward and quickly rushed to the back of Mr. 1. After all, Mr. 1 has a large knife on the front of his head and is easily attacked. Although Luffy is reckless, he still has the sense to be wary of these sharp weapons. Luffy rushed behind Mr. 1's butt. He stretched his hands back, and then pushed them toward Mr. 1's butt in front of him. Rubber. Bazooka. Luffy's hands hit Mr. 1's butt with surprising force. Mr. 1 is now in a chaotic and violent state, and his body control ability has declined. This blow directly knocked it forward several meters. But Mr. 1 is Mr. 1 after all. His body strength is amazing, and he can stabilize his body like a steel rhinoceros. "Okay, let me give you another move." Luffy jumped up suddenly, and his hands started to punch down from mid-air crazily. Rubber. Tempest. Luffy punched dozens of times in a row, all of which hit Mr. 1's back. There was a piercing sound of thud, and Luffy finally stopped attacking. He fell to the ground. "It hurts." Luffy cried out in pain, his fist was almost swollen to death. After all, Mr. One's body is indestructible, so Luffy's attack made his fists hurt terribly. After Luffy attacked, MS Spring Water Goddess also started to attack. MS the Goddess of Spring Water picked up the iron axe, raised it, and whispered an ancient spell in her mouth. Then a wind was generated from around the iron axe. Wind blade. A blade formed by a wind shot out from the iron axe, the same as a 3-meter-long blade. The wind blade hit Mr. One's body, knocking him over. After Mr. One was knocked over, he regained his balance. Mr. Ninja King also quickly rushed to the left side of Mr. One at this time. He rolled over for a while, and took out a strange weapon from the waist pack. The weapons are 2 rods of fine steel, held together by an iron chain. This is the Nunchaku, a powerful melee weapon. The Nunchaku was thrown out by Mr. Ninja King at the right moment and wrapped around the knee joint of Mr. One's left leg. Eat me another Nunchaku. Mr. Ninja King took out another Nunchaku, rolled to the right rear of Mr. One, and found the right opportunity to throw out the Nunchaku. The Nunchakus wrapped around the knee joint of Mr. One's right leg. Mr. One's knees were restrained. Then Mr. One started to move, but the joints of his legs were restricted and it was difficult to move. Finished, said Mr. Ninja King. Usopp said in surprise, there are such cool combat weapons. A smile appeared on the corner of Sauron's mouth, and he said, you guys are really a weapon arsenal. Chopper also rushed forward, and his body began to deform. He took a bite of the Rambo ball first. Strengthening. Chopper turned into a reindeer form, but the difference was that his antlers became very huge, even bigger than the iron plow for plowing the ground. Try this, don't think you're the only one with horns. Chopper quickly ran over. Mr. One was still in a state of rage and chaos. He stabbed Chopper with the big knife on his head. Chopper's huge antlers collided with the sword on Mr. One's head. What is shocking is that Chopper's antlers are not broken, and they are connected to the big knife on the opponent's head. It's like a steel rhino fighting a strong reindeer. In this state of wrestling strength, my antlers are not only huge, but also comparable to steel, Chopper said while resisting. It was difficult for the steel to cut through the steel, and Chopper pushed forward with all his strength. Although Mr. One is powerful, he was unable to exert his power normally due to his descent into violence and chaos. Chopper actually pushed Mr. One, who was far stronger than him, a lot. Chopper is so awesome, Luffy shouted happily. Chopper tried his best to resist Mr. One. But Mr. One was still very powerful after all, and he still kept his pace. Although the hind legs are difficult to move, they can exert force. Chopper was pushed back gradually. It's impossible to strengthen your wrist strength if this continues. Chopper jumped away quickly, and the antlers retracted, and this time he stood as steady as his human form. And the arms become very strong. Chopper's strong muscles at this time were simply terrifying. The ball muscles on his 2 arms were the size of footballs, although they still seemed out of sync with the reindeer's hooves. But it can use amazing attack power. Chopper held his hooves together like a cherry blossom. Carved hoof. Sakura blowing snow. Chopper's arms struck Mr. One's neck with astonishing force. This blow was comparable to being hit by a shell, and Sakura Fubuki's power also had a penetrating shock effect. Mr. One received a heavy blow on his neck, and his whole body shook violently for a while. Then fell heavily to the side. That's amazing, Luffy shouted in surprise. Usopp looked at Chopper and said, Chopper's attack is really powerful. Such a powerful force. But I need to continue to attack with rotten eggs. Usopp continued to shoot rotten egg stars with his slingshot. The reason why Mr. One was able to be suppressed in the battle was largely due to the destruction of his senses. Mr. One struggled to stand up again, and an angry and confused roar came from his mouth. At this time, Luffy suddenly attacked from behind his butt again. Rubber. Roundabout. This time, Luffy's right arm rotated a lot like a spring, and finally, with a huge amount of force, he aimed a punch at Mr. One's butt. This punch had an astonishing force, hitting Mr. One directly on the butt. In addition, the joints of his legs were jammed by Nunk hooks. Mr. One shook for a while and then fell to the ground. Ah ha ha ha, it worked, Luffy jumped happily. Chopper also told Luffy to pay attention to his wounds. Luffy also accumulated a lot of wounds in previous battles, and now he has begun to crack during the battle. However, Luffy, who was immersed in happiness, thought it was the stimulation of excitement, and did not realize the pain and harm. Pirate Plant Fruit. Author, Lee A Dream. Chapter 239. Although Mr. One was knocked down to the ground, he quickly stood up again. Although the series of blows just now were successful, they couldn't really hurt this burly guy. Chong. A harsh metallic roar came from Mr. One's mouth. Chopper saw Mr. One's appearance and said, "It seems we can't really defeat him." Sauron stepped forward at this time and said, "Okay, everyone. It's time for me to go." Zoro strode forward, gripping the handle of the samurai sword at his waist, ready to pull it out at any time. Mr. One also became calmer when he saw Zoro going into battle. Sauron seemed to be able to evoke his pain visibly. It was precisely because of Sauron's powerful blow before that Mr. One went crazy and turned into this form. "Come on, monster," Zoro said provocatively to Mr. One. Zoro quickly pulled out the ghost from his waist and pointed it at Mr. One. Zoro's legs alternated at an alarming speed, but his upper body did not move. The ghost in his hand was pointed straight towards Mr. One. Wind step. Swift slash. Zoro quickly moved in front of Mr. One, and stabbed Mr. One in the mouth with the ghost sword in his hand. Mr. One roared angrily and then retreated towards the rear. Zoro just stabbed Mr. One in the mouth with ghost. Although Mr. One is an indestructible body, his body is made of metal from the inside out. But just like the strength of different parts of the human body is different, the external defense of Mr. One's indestructible body is extremely high, but the internal part is still equivalent to some relatively fragile metal, and the hardness is not high. Zoro used this high-speed assassination attack to stab Mr. One in the mouth. When Mr. One retreated in pain, Zoro did not give up. Zoro pulled out Yukino again, clenched the two knives with both arms. The two samurai swords were placed parallel to each other. Zoro quickly attacked Mr. One with his parallel swords. Two swords. Two cuts. Zoro slashed Mr. One's abdomen twice horizontally with two parallel katana swords. Although he couldn't really cut open Mr. One's body, the powerful force knocked him down. The knockdown Mr. One lay down on the ground behind him. But this was not enough. Zoro took out the Hideo Yazuan from the scabbard at his waist. Sauron held the word Hideo in his mouth. Three-sword style. Pioneer. The samurai sword held by Zoro's arms and the blade of the samurai sword in his mouth were joined together. Zoro gathered his strength and rushed towards Mr. One at high speed. Mr. One reluctantly stood up again, but Zoro's three sword lights rushed towards him. Zoro's three slashes all hit Mr. One's head and neck. Mr. One raised his head, and then his whole body fell down again. Zoro continued to use various sword moves to attack Mr. One. Zoro discovered a way to deal with Mr. One. Although except for his steel-cutting move that could really kill Mr. One, other sword moves could also kill Mr. One even if the force could be transmitted correctly. During the attack, Sauron paid attention to weakening the beheading attack and strengthening the release of power. As a result, Mr. One can be successfully knocked to the ground every time. "Wow, why is Zoro so powerful?" Luffy said in surprise. Usopp raised his chin in a mysterious way and said, "Sauron is able to reach the level he is today. He really deserves to be a swordsman who grew up under Captain Usopp's flag." Chopper immediately looked at Usopp in surprise and said, "You guided Sauron to be so powerful. Do you know how to fight anything except medical skills?" Usopp snapped his fingers proudly and said, "Of course, Captain Usopp is omnipotent in battle." "That's awesome," Chopper said in admiration. Zoro continues to fight Mr. One. Continuously used various attack moves to knock down Mr. One more than 10 times. "Chiang!" Mr. One yelled. Mr. One, who was in a violent state, landed on all fours, preparing to rush towards Zoro. Zoro put away Yukisashi and Wada, leaving only Onitsu with a samurai sword. Zoro looked at Mr. One full of fighting spirit, his eyes as sharp as knives piercing Mr. One's body. Zoro held Kaititsu tightly with both hands and placed him in front of his body. One sword style. Iai slaying. The lion sings. Zoro made another powerful blow of his. Mr. One also rushed over. But Sauron's figure had already rushed behind Mr. One in a flash of lightning. But Mr. One had a shocking scar on his neck. "Chiang!" Mr. One roared violently. This knife severely wounded his neck. Although he did not die, it caused him great pain. There was a huge scar on Mr. One's neck. This guy, who was already in a violent state, became even more crazy after being injured for the second time. Mr. One rushed towards Sauron, but this time he seemed even crazier and out of control. He swung his blade-like claws to attack Sauron fiercely, and the attack force scratched and shattered the surrounding ground into a group of broken stones. But Zoro relied on his very flexible movements to avoid these attacks. Boom! The ground near Zoro was scratched and collapsed. As the ground collapsed, a large expanse of seawater was revealed below. Just now, Rog and Sauron fell into the trap together, where they saw that the pyramid building was actually built in a large artificial seawater area. The pyramid building and the base ground area below it are now dilapidated and severely destroyed due to ongoing intense fighting. Now that the ground has collapsed, everyone can finally see the seawater below. "How could this happen?" Usopp said in shock. "By the way, there is seawater below," Chopper said, looking at the exposed seawater in the collapsed area. Mr. Ninja King looked at the seawater and said, "Crocodile built his headquarters on an artificial seawater lake. There are also many banana crocodiles below." Mr. One continued to attack Sauron crazily. His massive attacks, coupled with the severe damage caused here before, caused more and more places to collapse. As more and more places collapsed, the large caves formed in these collapsed areas began to move. Usopp and Chopper looked at these large caves with fearful eyes. Immediately afterwards, huge terrifying carnivorous creatures began to crawl out of these large caves. Giant banana crocodile. The giant banana crocodiles began to crawl out, swinging their huge bodies on the ground in this area. Soon, 4 giant banana alligators crawled out of the cave. 3 of them looked at Sauron and Mr. One, who were fighting and chasing fiercely. 3 giant banana alligators crawled towards the 2 of them. The other end is crawling towards Chopper and the others. 3 giant banana crocodiles soon surrounded Zoro and Mr. One. Although they don't crawl very fast, their huge size means that a small amount of movement can cover a long distance and range. Ow! A giant banana crocodile took the lead and opened its mouth to swallow Zoro and Mr. One in one go. Sauron and Mr. One didn't even care about these giant banana crocodiles during the chase and battle.